It started with a $50 fine. A single piece of paper in my mailbox, ordering me to pay up for the crime of fishing in the lake I'd lived on for over a decade. It was petty, it was absurd, but to my HOA, it was law. That piece of paper, however, was just the first shot in a war I never saw coming. The fines quickly escalated, the passive-aggressive notices became outright threats, and the board made it their personal mission to break me. They thought their power was absolute. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They never considered what would happen if the man they were fining for using the lake decided to just buy the entire thing. They were about to learn that lesson the hard way. For 11 years, my house was more than just a structure of wood and drywall, it was my sanctuary. I'd bought the modest, single-story home for one reason and one reason only, the small, private lake that bordered the backyard. It wasn't a grand or impressive body of water, but to me, it was everything. It was my escape hatch from a world that had grown too loud, too complicated. My job in the city was a high-pressure cooker of deadlines and demands, and those quiet mornings on my small wooden dock were the steam valve that kept me from boiling over. Before the sun even thought about climbing over the distant hills, I would be out there, coffee in hand, casting a line into the glassy water. I rarely ever kept the fish. That wasn't the point. The point was the rhythmic flick of the wrist, the gentle plop of the lure breaking the surface, and the patient waiting. It was a meditation, a ritual that cleared my head and settled my soul. In all my years there, not a single neighbor had ever complained. I was quiet, I kept to myself, and I respected the shared beauty of our community. People would wave as they walked their dogs along the manicured paths, and I'd wave back. We were all living the suburban dream, or so I thought. Our neighborhood, Lakewood Estates, prided itself on its idyllic appearance. The lawns were uniformly green, the houses were painted in a palette of approved muted tones, and the Homeowners Association, the HOA, was the unseen force ensuring everything stayed perfect. When I first moved in, I saw the HOA as a necessary, if slightly annoying, part of the package. They made sure property values stayed high and that nobody painted their house hot pink. I received the welcome packet, complete with a binder 3 inches thick detailing every rule and regulation, from the approved species of garden flowers to the mandatory distance between a mailbox and the curb. I laughed, filed it away in a cabinet, and promptly forgot about it. For a decade, my interactions with the HOA were limited to paying my quarterly dues and receiving the occasional cheerful newsletter about the annual community picnic. It was a system that worked because it was practically invisible. But that all changed about 6 months ago, when a woman named Carol Albright was elected board president. Carol was a retired office manager who treated our half-square-mile community like her own personal fiefdom. She saw rules not as guidelines for harmonious living, but as weapons to be wielded. Her reign began subtly. First, it was notes left on doors about garbage cans being left out 10 minutes past the designated time. Then it was formal warnings about unapproved garden gnomes. I witnessed her, from my living room window, approach my next-door neighbor, a sweet elderly man named George, with a ruler to measure the height of his prize-winning roses because they were allegedly 1/4 inch too tall. George, a man who had fought in 2 wars, looked utterly defeated as he agreed to trim them down. Carol's presence became a constant, low-grade source of anxiety in the neighborhood. Her white golf cart was her chariot, and she patrolled the quiet streets with the focused intensity of a hawk searching for prey. She never smiled, she only observed, her lips perpetually pursed in a thin line of disapproval as she scribbled notes onto a clipboard. I felt a sense of pity for the people she targeted, but also a naive sense of immunity. My property was immaculate. I followed all the obvious rules. And my quiet fishing was a harmless activity that had been part of the neighborhood's fabric for longer than Carol had been in charge. I was wrong. The foreshadowing began on a crisp Tuesday morning. The air was still, the lake was a perfect mirror of the pale blue sky, and the only sound was the chirping of birds. It was the kind of morning I lived for. As I sat on my dock, lost in the tranquility, I saw the silent approach of her white golf cart along the community path that ran about 50 yards behind my property line. It slowed to a stop. I couldn't make out her expression from that distance, but I didn't need to. She just sat there, watching me. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She just watched for a full minute, made a long, deliberate note on her clipboard, and then slowly drove away. The peace of my morning was shattered. The silence of the lake suddenly felt heavy, and for the first time in over a decade, my sanctuary felt exposed. I didn't know it then, but a line had just been drawn, not in the water, but in the sand. The silent threat from the golf cart hung in the air for a week. Every morning I went to the dock, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if I were being watched through binoculars from a curtained window. I tried to ignore it, to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from me, but the tranquility was gone. It was replaced by a tense, watchful waiting. Then, the first letter arrived. It was printed on crisp, cream-colored paper, embossed with the Lakewood Estates HOA logo. It wasn't a fine, not yet. It was, in the words of the letter, a formal notification of bylaw enforcement. It cited Article 117, Section C, of the HOA Covenant, the use of common waterways for unsanctioned recreational activities, including but not limited to boating, swimming, and angling, is strictly prohibited to maintain the aesthetic harmony and ecological balance of the community. I stared at the word angling. A rule so obscure I doubted anyone, even the original authors, remembered it existed. A rule that had laid dormant for the entire 11 years I'd lived there. This wasn't a long-standing community standard, this was a weapon that had been dug up and dusted off specifically for me. Believing that reason could still prevail, I spent an afternoon composing a polite and carefully worded email to the HOA board. I explained my long history of quiet, respectful fishing. I emphasized that it was a solitary, catch-and-release activity that had no impact on the lake's ecology or the neighborhood's harmony. I attached photos of my clean, well-maintained dock and the small, simple tackle box I used. I was appealing to them as neighbors, as fellow community members. I was asking for an exemption, a grandfather clause, a simple dose of common sense. The reply came less than an hour later, and its speed and coldness were a slap in the face. It was from Carol. She informed me that the board's duty is to enforce the bylaws as written, not as they have been selectively ignored in the past. Past non-enforcement does not constitute a permanent waiver of the rule. She had CC'd the entire board. It was a formal declaration of war. Still, a part of me refused to believe it. It was just too absurd. So, the next morning, in a quiet act of defiance, I went to my dock and cast my line. 2 days later, the first fine appeared in my mailbox. $50. Tucked inside the envelope was a small, grainy photograph of me, fishing, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The violation notice was a cold, impersonal form, but that photograph felt deeply personal. I was being surveilled in my own backyard. The anger that began to simmer inside me was hot and sharp. This was no longer about a forgotten rule. This was about power. I decided I wouldn't be bullied. I followed the official procedure and filed an appeal, requesting a hearing at the next monthly HOA meeting. I spent weeks preparing, gathering my thoughts, and creating a short, logical presentation. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that if I could just stand before my neighbors and make my case, they would see the ridiculousness of it all. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse felt less like a gathering place and more like a courtroom. The 5 board members, with Carol at the center, sat at a long table at the front, looking down at the assembled residents. When my name was called, I walked to the podium, my heart pounding. I spoke about my 11 years in the community, about my love for the lake, about how my harmless hobby was a form of therapy. I tried to connect with them on a human level. But when I finished, Carol didn't address me. She addressed the audience. She spoke of liability risks, of potential damage to the retaining walls, of the precedent it would set. She twisted my quiet, solitary activity into a threat to the entire community's insurance premiums and property values. Then, she opened the floor for questions, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the entire room had been seated against me. A man I'd never seen before asked if my fishing hooks could be a danger to the neighborhood children. A woman stood up and claimed she was worried my presence on the dock was an invasion of her privacy. It was a coordinated ambush. My actual neighbors, the ones who had waved to me for years, sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the floor, too intimidated to speak out against Carol and her board. My appeal was denied in a unanimous vote. The public humiliation was complete. I walked out of that clubhouse feeling utterly isolated, branded as a troublemaker in the one place I called home. The next day, the harassment escalated. Another $50 fine was in my mailbox. And another the day after that. Carol had made it clear, every single day I chose to fish, the financial penalty would stack up. Within 2 weeks, I was facing over $700 in fines. They were no longer just mailing them, I'd find the bright orange violation slips tucked into my doorframe, placed under the windshield wiper of my car. It was a relentless, psychological campaign designed to wear me down, to make me surrender. My sanctuary had become my prison, and the daily battle was draining my bank account and my will to fight. I was losing. One evening, sitting at my kitchen table, I stared at the growing pile of orange slips, a monument to my own stubbornness. The feeling of helplessness was crushing. I felt trapped, with no legal recourse and no support from my community. My eyes drifted from the fines to the HOA's official letterhead lying on the table. It had a small, stylized map of Lakewood Estates printed in the corner. I traced the property lines with my finger, the neat little squares representing each home. Then my finger stopped on the lake. It was shaded blue, of course, but unlike the parks and the clubhouse, which were clearly labeled HOA common property, the lake had no such designation. It was just, there. A blank space. A tiny detail, probably a printing error, but in that moment of despair, it felt like a flicker of light in a dark room. That flicker ignited a fire. My despair curdled into a new, cold determination. I stopped thinking about the fines and started thinking about that map. I spent the next 2 weeks living a double life. By day, I went to work. At night, my house became a war room. I turned my dining table into a mess of documents, digging out the original deed to my house and the thick binder of HOA covenants I had ignored for so long. I spent hours online, navigating the county's clunky public records website, searching for property plats and zoning documents dating back to the 1970s, when Lakewood Estates was first developed from a stretch of farmland. My neighbors saw my lights on at all hours and probably thought I was agonizing over the fines. In truth, I had forgotten all about them. I was on the hunt. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night, deep in the digital archives of the county clerk's office. I found the original master plat for the development. There, in black and white, was the undeniable truth. The developer had purchased and subdivided all the land for the houses, the roads, and the common areas. But the lake itself, originally a natural body of water known as Miller's Pond, was a separate parcel entirely. The developer had built around it, but the lake itself was never legally incorporated into the Lakewood Estates HOA. For 40 years, everyone had simply assumed the HOA owned it because they cut the grass around the edge. But they didn't. Their authority, their rules, their fines, they were all built on a lie. The discovery was a surge of pure adrenaline, but it was followed by a sobering reality. If the HOA didn't own the lake, who did? I couldn't just keep fishing, that would be trespassing on someone else's property. My fight wasn't over, it had just taken a wild, unexpected turn. I hired a local real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Dave, and tasked him with one thing: find the legal owner of Miller's Pond. A week later, he called. "Frank, you're not going to believe this," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "The lake is still legally owned by a family trust. The original farmers. The trust is managed by 3 siblings, all in their late 70s, scattered across the country." I spoke to their lawyer. Frank, they don't even know they own a lake. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the water that had caused me so much grief. It wasn't just a lake anymore. It was an opportunity. My lawyer's words, "they don't even know they own a lake," echoed in my mind for days. They weren't just words of confirmation, they were the keys to a door I never knew existed. My plan began to form, not as a burst of vengeful anger, but as a slow, cold, and meticulously calculated strategy. Through Dave, my lawyer, I extended a formal offer to the 3 siblings of the Miller family trust. It was a fair, modest sum, enough to be enticing for a property they didn't manage or even know existed, but not so much that it would cripple me. To them, it was found money, a check appearing out of the blue for a forgotten piece of their family's history. To me, it was the purchase of my freedom. They accepted without a counteroffer. The next 3 weeks were the most agonizing of my life. As Dave handled the legal machinery of the sale, the title searches, the contracts, the escrow account, I had to play the part of the defeated man. I stopped fishing. I left my dock to gather a thin layer of dust and leaves. To complete the illusion, I wrote a check to the Lakewood Estates HOA for the full amount of the fines I had accrued, $2,850. I included a short, terse note stating that I was paying under protest but wished to be considered a member in good standing. From my window, I saw Carol's golf cart slow down as she passed my house that week. I could almost feel the smug satisfaction radiating from her. In her mind, the fight was over. She had broken the rebellious resident. She had won. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I got the call. "The deed was recorded with the county an hour ago," Dave said, his voice calm and professional. "The funds have been transferred. It's official. Congratulations, Frank. You own a lake." A wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. It wasn't a feeling of triumphant joy, but of a deep, tectonic shift in my world. I walked to my back window and looked out at the water. It looked different. The light hit it in a way it never had before. It was mine. But I didn't grab my fishing rod. The time for that was over. This was a much bigger game now, and I knew I had to choose the perfect moment to make my move. The HOA's annual State of the Community meeting, scheduled for the following Saturday, would be the perfect stage. The community clubhouse was buzzing with a kind of forced cheerfulness. There were platters of cookies, a large urn of weak coffee, and a banner that read, "Lakewood Estates, a community of excellence." Carol Albright was in her element, mingling with residents, her voice a pitch higher than usual, radiating the magnanimous energy of a benevolent queen. I took a seat in the back, nursing a cup of coffee, and simply watched. I was invisible to them, just another face in the crowd. The meeting droned on with budget reports and landscaping updates. Finally, Carol took the stage for her president's address. She saved her victory lap for the end. A slide appeared on the projector screen behind her, titled, "Upholding Our Community Standards." Without using my name, she launched into a thinly veiled parable about a recent challenge the board had faced. She spoke of a resident whose flagrant disregard for the bylaws threatened to undermine the very fabric of the community. She painted herself as the valiant defender of order, the one willing to make the tough decisions to protect everyone's property values. And then, for her grand finale, she held up a copy of my check. "I'm pleased to report," she announced, her voice ringing with triumph, "that the resident in question has seen the error of his ways and is now fully compliant. This just goes to show that our covenants are strong, and our enforcement is effective." A smattering of polite applause filled the room. She was at the absolute zenith of her power, basking in the glow of her perceived victory. During the final Q&A session, I stood up and walked calmly to the microphone at the front of the room. A nervous murmur rippled through the audience. Carol's smile froze on her face, replaced by a look of sharp annoyance. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I believe we have already discussed and resolved your particular issue. This time is for new business." "This is new business," Carol, I said, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. It's about the lake. I turned to face my neighbors. For the past few months, the board has been fining me under Bylaw 117C for fishing on what they repeatedly call an HOA common waterway. Carol's eyes narrowed. She was preparing to cut me off, but I was faster. Out of curiosity, I decided to do some research. I have here, I said, lifting a thick folder, a certified copy of the original master plat for Lakewood Estates, filed in 1978, along with the current property deeds from the county registrar. The room was dead silent. Every eye was on me. These documents show something fascinating, I continued. They show that the developer deeded the roads, the green spaces, and this very clubhouse to the HOA. But the lake, Miller's Pond, was never part of that transaction. The simple fact is, the Lakewood Estates HOA has never, not for a single day in its 40-year history, actually owned the lake. A collective gasp went through the room. The board members started whispering frantically to each other. Carol's face, projected onto the large screen behind her, had gone chalk white. She finally found her voice, sputtering, that's a procedural technicality. We have maintained the shoreline for decades. We have a duty of community stewardship. Stewardship is not ownership, I said, my voice cutting through her panic. And you cannot fine a resident for breaking a rule on land you do not own. But you did raise an interesting point. The lake absolutely needs a responsible owner, someone to act as a proper steward. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room. So I found the legal owners. I looked directly at Carol, whose face was now a mask of pure, horrified disbelief. They were an elderly family trust out of state, I explained to the stunned audience. They were quite shocked to learn that an HOA was illegally extorting fines from a resident for using their property. They were very concerned about the legal liability. So concerned, in fact, that they decided the best course of action was to sell the property immediately. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. It was a freshly filed deed, stamped and certified by the county. As of last Tuesday, I announced, my voice ringing through the silent room, I am the sole, legal owner of Miller's Pond. The lake is my private property. The silence was deafening. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The board sat frozen, their mouths agape. Carol looked like she had seen a ghost. I let the reality of the situation sink in before delivering the final blow. Therefore, I am here tonight to make two announcements. First, effective immediately, the lake and the 10 feet of shoreline surrounding it are closed to all residents of Lakewood Estates. The walking path that falls within that boundary is now on my land, and anyone using it will be considered to be trespassing. Second, I said, turning my full attention back to the humiliated woman on the stage, I will be expecting a full refund of the $2,850 in fraudulent fines you collected from me. I'll expect that check by the end of the week. I placed the deed on the podium, turned my back on the speechless board, and walked back to my seat, leaving a state of complete and utter chaos in my wake. The power had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably overturned. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was not a loud explosion, but a deafening silence followed by a cascade of quiet collapses. I didn't stay for the chaos. The moment I finished speaking, I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, not looking back. I didn't need to see the fallout, I could feel it. The frantic whispers, the accusations, the complete and total implosion of a power structure that had been built on nothing but a 40-year-old assumption. The air outside was cool and crisp, and as I walked home under the perfectly spaced, HOA-approved streetlights, I took the deepest breath I had in months. It was the breath of a man who had not just won a fight, but had ended a war. As expected, the HOA's first move was a letter from their lawyer. It was a masterpiece of bluster and intimidation, filled with legal jargon about prescriptive easements and adverse possession, essentially arguing that because they had maintained the shoreline for so long, they had a right to it. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort. I forwarded it to my lawyer, Dave, who dismantled their entire argument in a single, 3-paragraph response that was so legally airtight it was practically a work of art. His final sentence was a polite but firm reminder that his client was well within his rights to pursue legal action against the HOA for the collection of fraudulent fines. After that, the legal threats from their side ceased entirely. 1 week later, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a check from the Lakewood Estates HOA for $2,850. There was no note, no letter of apology, not even a memo on the check itself. It was the most satisfyingly bitter and silent admission of defeat I could have ever imagined. I cashed it that afternoon. The real drama, however, played out within the community itself. Carol Albright's reign was over. The public humiliation was too complete, the exposure of her incompetence too absolute. A special emergency meeting was called, not by the board, but by a petition signed by over half the neighborhood's residents. Carol was removed as president by a vote of no confidence. She didn't even show up to the meeting to defend herself. A few weeks after that, a "for sale" sign was hammered into her perfectly manicured lawn. She sold her house in less than a month and was gone, vanishing from the neighborhood as quickly as her power had. The white golf cart was never seen again. The rest of the board members who had sat silently beside her resigned in disgrace over the next couple of months. True to my word, the day after the meeting, I had professional signs installed at regular intervals around the lake. They were simple, elegant, and unambiguous: private property. No trespassing. Access by written permission of owner only. The effect was immediate. The morning joggers found new routes. The evening dog walkers now stayed strictly to the sidewalks. The community walking path, which had been the pride of the neighborhood, was now empty, a silent testament to the new reality. At first, there was resentment. I understood it. My fight with the board had consequences for everyone. I received a few anonymous, angry notes in my mailbox from people who felt their lifestyle had been unfairly disrupted. They didn't see the bigger picture, they only saw a path they could no longer use. I weathered this period in silence, knowing that my next move had to be my own, not a reaction to their anger. My goal was never to be a tyrant, it was to dismantle a tyranny. After a new, and far more reasonable, HOA board was elected, I received a tentative email from the new president, a man named Mark who I'd always known to be a level-headed neighbor. He didn't make demands or threats. He simply asked if I would be willing to sit down and talk. We met on my back patio, the very place where this whole ordeal had begun. He was apologetic, sincere, and most importantly, he was respectful. He asked if there was any way the community could regain access to the shoreline path. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the end game. I told him I was open to the idea, but under very specific conditions. My lawyer, Dave, drafted a formal access agreement. It was a simple, one-page document. In it, I, the legal owner of Miller's Pond, would grant the residents of Lakewood Estates a permanent easement to use the shoreline path for recreational purposes. In return, the HOA would agree to two things. First, they would pay me a symbolic fee of $1 per year, a legal necessity to make the contract binding and continually reinforce who held the actual ownership. Second, and most importantly, the agreement contained a clause explicitly stating that the Lakewood Estates HOA held no authority, and could never claim authority, over the lake itself. All bylaws and covenants pertaining to the common waterway were to be struck from their records. They agreed to every single term. At the next community meeting, the new board presented the agreement to the residents, and it was approved unanimously. I signed the document, the HOA president signed the document, and a new era in our neighborhood began. The private property signs came down, and the walkers and joggers returned to the path. But everything was different. The HOA no longer operated as an unchecked power, it operated as a genuine community management organization, its authority now clearly defined and its limitations understood by all. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I see my neighbors out on the path. They wave, and I wave back. It's a different kind of wave now. It's not the casual gesture of strangers sharing a zip code, it's a wave of mutual respect, of a shared history. They know I own the lake, but they also know I fought a battle that, in the end, benefited everyone by restoring sanity and reason to our community. This morning, I woke up before dawn, just as I always have. I walked out to my dock with my coffee and my fishing rod. The air was still, and the water was a sheet of dark glass reflecting the pale, pre-dawn sky. I cast my line, and the gentle plop of the lure was the only sound in the world. The peace I felt was no longer fragile. It was a deep, quiet, and unshakable tranquility. It was the peace that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from winning it. I had my sanctuary back, but I had gained something more, the knowledge that the lines that define our lives are only as strong as our willingness to question them. It makes you wonder, how many of the rules we're told to follow are built on nothing more than the assumption that we'll never bother to check the paperwork? What invisible lines are drawn around your life, and who truly owns them?